Welcome to the quick start video for Rocket Lasso's newest tool, Slicer. The purpose of this video is to go through a series of short projects and just kind of explore different ways you might be able to use this tool. Keep in mind there is a series of instructional videos that step through every single parameter, and that's a good way of learning exactly how to use it on a more technical side. But this is more diving in, seeing opportunities and potential that you can get out of this plugin. So why don't we jump on into Cinema 4D? Here we are inside of Cinema 4D S24, although Slicer and all of the Rocket Lasso plugins are working back in R20 and beyond, and we'll be continuing to keep those updated, of course. I would like to start with a project that I actually get a question about all the time during my live streams where I answer Cinema 4D questions. So to do that, I would like to start with a Cinema 4D landscape object, and the only change I'll make is making it a bit taller. And now we need Slicer. Assuming you've installed it, you can find it under the plugins dropdown or extensions dropdown, depending on your version of Cinema. Under there, I can find my Rocket Slicer. Creating that, I can make the landscape a child of the Slicer. And the instant I do, you're going to see that Slicer consumes the landscape and is now returning a series of splines. It is cutting directly across the object and returning these splines. Selecting Slicer, we can see a couple of its properties. The most obvious one here is the number of slices. So we can change the number of cuts, but you see we're not quite catching the entire object. Let's grab the axis and change it to pivot from the bottom instead of the center. And then you can see it's pivoting from that bottom point going upward. I can grab this little widget, this handle, and pull it up into the air to change how far that's going. That's controlling this spread parameter. And now you can see that it's capturing the entire landscape. And we can change the number of cuts to be whatever size we want. Now that's returning a series of splines, but it doesn't have to be splines. Inside of the geometry tab, we can change this to have some geometry. So let's begin with flat, and now it's creating some flat geometry in between every single layer. Nice and clean. Those are all n-gons. We can also set it to extruded geometry, and now you can see that those have some thickness on top of them. Changing that to percentage mode, I can actually get the gaps completely closed in between every single one just with a single slider, which is very handy. Now, we don't, in this case, need the bottom of the cap, so I shall turn off the bottom one underneath. And now we just have the top, and then we can add some bevel on top of that. So let's increase the bevel size, and we can have that go really small and just be nice and sharp in the corner, or crank it up all the way and take up that entire layer. Adding in a few extra segments, we can round that out a bunch. And you can see how quickly we're able to make some pretty crazy looking geometry. Now, we have additional settings to play around with. There are a lot of them. Going back inside the slicer, I can go to the main tab and let's play around with the smooth parameter. If we zoom in here, you can see that some of these angles look a little bit sharp. You can see we get these little pinches going. So hitting NB on the keyboard, you can see that's because, hey, it's just cutting the landscape, and wherever it cut, that's where the points are going to be. And here, it just happened to be very close together. And here, those are pretty close together. And all over the place, their spacing isn't very even. But with smoothing, it will run an iteration where it's taking every single point of that spline, checking on its neighbors and averaging them out. So by increasing the smoothing by 1, you see how much that is going to round that out and make it so much more even and smooth. Zooming out a bit, hitting NA, you can see how smooth that is just with one iteration, but we could add another and another and just get that nice and clean and rounded. And I think that's a great feature added on top to have just even more control over exactly the way everything is going to be sliced. Let's get rid of that smooth and then back into the geometry tab. And I'd like to point out that here's another cool little feature is you can see the icon right now is showing geometry, and that's because we're in one of these geometry modes. But if we go to none to go back to spline, you'll see that the icon changes to a spline icon. That can be pretty handy. Let's zoom out a bit, back to the main tab. Let's take a look at another parameter. We've got expand. Expand is going to take a look at where the slice currently is and look at the normal of the polygon that's being cut from, and we can actually expand that and push it outward and make this larger and larger and larger. And you can even go negative on that and shrink it down, down, down. Something important to note is that this doesn't have any kind of special intelligence behind it. It's just moving those lines. So if you push it too far, you can start getting these crisscrossing lines, and something like a Cinema 4D extrude won't like those very much, but you can definitely do it. And then smoothing comes after that. So you can, of course, smooth that again afterward and get that nice and smooth. Getting rid of both of those, let's take a look at one last parameter for now, and that will be rate. By adding in some automatic rate, I can hit play on the timeline and you'll see this animating. What's happening is it's going anywhere from this bottom line and traveling the individual slices up until we get to that topmost line and then loops them back down to the bottom. We haven't covered anywhere near all of the parameters here in Slicer, but there's actually a few extra parameters I'd like to talk about here in the main tab. We want to keep the main tab clean and not overwhelming, but there are some more parameters hidden away, and you can get to them by twirling down this little triangle next to spread. Inside of there, you can see we've got extra parameters of variation, offset, spacing, and seed. Now, the one to talk about right now is variation. That is going to add randomization between the distance of each layer. So now you can see just a little bit of extra spice there in the way that those are separated. You can click the random seed and change this number to get completely different layouts, or click this complete randomization button and get different layouts. Something that's cool about this is if we were to start increasing the rate here, it's going to start going faster and faster. But at a certain point, it's going to look a little bit weird because there's so many layers that how can you distinguish between them? So by increasing this even more, you see it's going really quick, but it's kind of just a blur. At a certain point, it starts looking like it's going backwards just because of how quick it's moving, and you can't tell with this many slices. It's like when a wheel is spinning on the highway. If, however, we take variation, we start adding some of that in, there's now a little bit of individualness between the layers, and it starts becoming very clear where they are spread out. So even going this fast, we can now feel them traveling upward. So a whole bunch of variation will go a long way there, and it's just pretty fun to use. Well, we're not going to talk about offset yet, but we'll definitely use that later on. But I definitely want to talk about spacing here, and spacing is great when you're doing something like with a landscape, and we'll be doing a lot more with the landscapes later on. To begin with, let's get rid of variation to keep it simple, and you'll see right now that we are pivoting from the axis on the bottom. So if we were to grab spacing and start zeroing that out, it's going to collapse this down to be completely flat where we are currently set, in this case, the bottom. And now we have a landscape that's been completely flattened. So it's almost like a topographical map now that we can view from the top. We still got some of that rate going. I will slow it down and hit play. And now those lines are traveling inward instead of feeling like they're traveling upward just by flattening that down. Slowing it down even more, we can see how those slowly transition in. Of course, the rate can be set to negative, so let's say -5, and now those will be traveling outward. But combine that with some variation to spread those out, and now we can really feel those lines separate. Let's go positive, and now we can go way faster, so I can speed those up a lot because we still see that separation as they move in. And yeah, it just unlocks a lot of power when it comes to a landscape object. So I love spacing, and I love variation. Keep in mind that the spacing is unclamped, so we could actually go above 100% and start making those even taller than the original object. And you can even go negative. So -100 would make this exactly inverted of the original object. So that type of thing can be interesting. Anywhere we possibly can inside of Slicer and any of the tools that we make, we are trying to have everything that can be unclamped, and everything that can go negative, make it go negative. Nothing's more frustrating than when you're like, oh, I need just a little bit more, and Cinema has a clamp on it. So yeah, we always avoid that. So that is going to wrap up part 1 of this quick start, but let's move into another project and see some additional features. In this next scene file, I've got a character mesh set up. If I hit NB, so we can see our polygons, you can see that this is not a particularly pretty mesh. It was created through a volume mesher. But for our purposes, all the polygons are very even and clean, so it should work well for something like Slicer. And considering we're going to be slicing it up, the base geometry doesn't really matter that much. So here's this character. What I would like to do is track down some animation, which if you're in the newer versions of Cinema, you can find inside of your asset browser. Inside of there, you've got your motion capture. And inside of there, you can find all these different folders. In this case, I'll say clapping and cheering. Grab cheering standing B for myself and collapse that down. Cool. Now we've got this set up. Twirling that down, we've got all these different joints that are making up this animation. If I hit play, you can see it's going to be animated and jumping around. So I would like to stick the mesh to these joints, which in Cinema can be really fast. I'd like to set this to its T-pose. So selecting this character definition tag, I can say go to reference pose. Twirling that down, because I don't need to see all of them, I can click the middle mouse button, which will select this object and automatically all of its children, and then also select the mesh. Having done that, I can say character, bind, and now it binds that character, creates a skin tag, and creates this weight map tag, and it should just be ready to animate. Deselecting everything, I can now hit play, and it pops into this pose, and it's animating along with that animation. Now, it's working great, except you'll see that that looks a little bit messed up in the shoulder area and the upper torso, and that's just the way the deformation is working out of the gate. We could spend some time and paint weights on here, But there is that newer tool in Cinema, this deformer called Delta Mush. If we take that and put it after the skin tag, it's going to look at all of the geometry and try and smooth it out and make it a little bit more logical on the way it's deforming. So adding a bunch more iterations on here, you can see I can clean that upper area up and get a nicer transition from the arm to the shoulder. And that's all I'm going to worry about for now for this character. Visually hiding the actual animation and twirling that down. Oops, turn that on. We can now start working from this character. Creating a new slicer from the extensions or plugin dropdown, you can find slicer, and this time I will move it to the bottom of the entire hierarchy because instead of using source geometry children this time and feeding it a child, let's set that to objects mode, which creates this inexclude that we can drag any mesh from anywhere in the scene file in, and it will link that way. So dragging the character into that field, instantly you can see we got a couple of slices traveling up the character. So let's zoom out a bit. You'll see that half the slices are underground because we're pivoting from the center. So a couple options we have there. First of all, we could move this entire thing. So because we're remote linked in, I'll collapse that. Because we are remote linked in, I can just move this freely. I can move that up into the air and place it, and it's not moving the original object, which is super handy out of the gate. We can scale this to be larger and perfectly fit that spacing. And we can change our orientation to something else. Let's change orientation from Y plus to, let's say, X plus. Now it's chopping along the character this way. I can shrink that up a bit and we can see additional cuts, and we can increase the number of slices, and you can see we get all these nice vertical cuts happening along X. We'd also change that to Z plus and get a crazy Z plus direction going, making it look pretty crazy on the character. And of course we hit play, and that's going to be animated on top of the character. And then we have the option of just moving this around or rotating it. I can move it forward or backward, and you could get animation that way if you wanted. But I can also hit rotate and spin this around to some other angle, any arbitrary angle, and just have it set up that way. Scale that larger to catch the entire character, and it's just ready to go. Hitting play, you can see that animation should still be working on top of it, and we're just cutting these diagonals. So that is going and changing this orientation, but we have additional options along those lines too. Let's say that we wanted to go to, let's go to regular Y plus, and I'll even hit this reset transform, or reset PSR as it used to be called. And now you can see we are set up down here, but the model is jumping up into the air and the hands are way up there. Let's say we wanted to automatically perfectly match the scale of the object. We can do that through this auto scale button. Clicking auto scale, it will change the orientation to its last mode, which is object Z plus. That automatically turned on this link field, created a null, named the null, and perfectly centered this on the character from the bottommost point all the way to the topmost point. Completely ready to go. And now instead of moving around the slicer, we can move around this null however we like. So I could spin that to the side, get some new orientation. And now that we've got this new arbitrary orientation, I can go back to the slicer and say, hey, auto scale again. And based on that current direction of the null in this case, it will rescale it to perfectly match the scaling of that. So it's very handy to use auto scale. You can just keep on repeatedly moving your axis around or changing the position, move everything exactly the way you want, and then just say, hey, auto scale again, and now we're perfectly matching the current situation. Often I will click auto scale and then just overshoot it a bit to make sure that maybe it jumps a little higher than I think, and maybe it's a little bit further on the ground as he jumps back down again and hits the ground. So just overscaling that a bit is my typical workflow. But now you can see we got a series of slices across this character. Oh, one thing to point out, I forgot. We have our source geometry here in object mode, but we have the ability to say, hey, this character, don't look at it for the slicer calculation. And we can also click this display button and turn the stoplights on the character off so it won't show up in the viewport and it won't show up in the render. And of course, click it again and put it back to neutral so it will show up. So a quick way of seeing that or not seeing that. Also, it eats up a lot of screen real estate. So you can always grab this handle and pull it up or down, or click this twirl down, or in this case, twirl up, and hide that so it doesn't eat up too much space. Now let's simplify this a bit. I would like the orientation to be back on the default Y plus. We don't need this null anymore. And inside of slicer, I'd like the axis to be on the bottom. Having done that, we have another kind of orientation mode set up here, and that is using matrix mode. Instead of clicking that checkbox though, something that's really handy is clicking this create matrix button. Before I click the button, you can see that we are cutting all along the character here, and the widget is right there in the bottom. It travels all the way to right there. So pay attention to that. Let's hide actually that widget, which is preview cuts. We can turn that off and that will now be hidden. And then let's also hide our character. So now if I click the Create Matrix button, it is going to create a matrix object for us. It's going to set this to matrix mode and drag that in automatically. But look, it's also starting from that same spot and ending in the same spot with the exact number of cuts that we already created. Now, if I hit, let's go and make these a little bit smaller, selecting the matrix. They're a little bit large because we're on this human scale. So let's set that to maybe 0.3, 0.3, 0.3. You see these individual cubes representing where the matrix is. Those are now determining where these cuts are. Inside of the slicer, we are on orientation Y, so the cuts will always still be across the Y axis, but the placement of them is based on the matrix. So if I were to, say, create a random effector, those will randomly move all over the place. The only ones that matter is moving up and down on Y, but you can see that these are now randomly placed. This can get a lot more interesting, though, if instead of using the matrix in grid array mode, what if we make a straight line? So from the front point of view, I will go into the spline pen tool and just create a line and a line. Overshooting a bit, hitting escape. We could zero that out, but the specifics don't matter too much there. I've pretty much just got a straight line going. So let's say that the matrix should clone onto an object, and that object will be the spline. So now, and let's delete that random effector for now. Now you can see that I've got 10 different cuts along that line, and those cuts are now corresponding on the character. Selecting the matrix, we can increase that count, and that is how many cuts there are on the character, just automatically set up for us. But this unlocks the ability to do things like use the rate that's built in on the matrix when it's being fed a spline. Let's give that a bit of rate and hit play. We can now see that traveling up, creating those slices, but now we can add in rate variation and have those travel at different speeds to get those randomized as well. Opens up a lot of possibilities there. Now, what can we do even further with the matrix? Well, let's go into the matrix transform tab and set this to just be a plain white color. And then inside of the matrix, while it's selected, create a new random effector. And that random effector, I don't want it to affect the position, but I do want it to affect the color. So color mode, effector color. And now you can see that these have been randomly colored. You can make them even more powerful or a little cleaner if you go to the effector tab, twirl down min max and say, hey, the color shouldn't go negative because negative colors just make everything darker. So let's say anywhere from 0 to 100. And now you might end up white up to black and any color in between. So you get all these nice random colors. So this matrix is now creating random colors. Inside of the slicer, though, we could do something like go into the spline tab and say, let's explode every layer. Currently, if we were to make the slicer editable, you can see it's a single spline object. But if I say segments, explode layer, if I make it editable, you will see we're returning a null and a series of splines. So undoing that, now that we're returning a series of individual splines, we have the ability to colorize them. So I will lock this parameter temporarily so I can deselect, because right now they're highlighted in orange. Deselecting, now we can see the natural color. In this case, it's black. Changing colorize to from matrix, the individual layers will take on the color of the matrix object that is generating it. So hitting play here, we can see that the colors are traveling up on the character, creating all those slices and generating these completely random colors. Let's add a couple of extra clones in there. Let's unlock that, select the matrix and say, hey, we need more. So we get all these super crazy colors doing all these slices on the character. And those are all ready to use however you want to. Usually, if you're going to render out these different colored lines, you'd want to do it with a third-party renderer. In this case, I have Redshift handy. So why don't we set this up very quickly to render that out? But this should work in pretty much every third-party renderer. So let's open up a Redshift render view. And we can even start that if we want to. Creating a brand new Redshift material. And basic one. We can apply that directly onto the spline. That won't do anything out of the gate. We need to have that show up first. So how do we make that show up? Well, you have to right click on a spline and say Redshift object. And that Redshift object will say, hey, this is supposed to be rendered somehow, this curve. So let's say render as hair strands. But still, nothing is going to show up. And that's because Redshift, I showed you, if we make this editable, that is a null with a series of splines. But this Redshift tag doesn't copy its way down. Different renderers might behave differently. So we compensate for that inside of Slicer. Inside of the spline tab, you can say there's a tag to segment. So if I drag that tag inside, it's going to copy that tag to every individual segment. And now you can see we have something that is actually rendering. So inside your renderer, you'll probably have some node similar to this. Double clicking inside the material graph, I can search for the word user in this case, select a color user data. I would like to output the object's display color. That's the one we need, display color. And that can output to anything. In this case, I'll say no color, but we do want an overall emission of, let's say, 4. So nice and bright. And I want to control the emission color. So that will be the output. We're outputting the color from slicer into the emission color, and the instant we do, we now have those splines colored exactly as the matrix was colorizing them. So very powerful there. While we're here on this topic, these display colors are still set up and Redshift is still rendering, but we have other colorize modes. So under colorize, currently these colors are from the matrix, but we could say, no, let's have those actually be completely random. So you see different colors have shown up, which are not based on the matrix anymore. It's being generated by Slicer. We could click randomize and get completely different colors every time we click. And then we also have, we can get colors from the grayscale. So we can randomly create anything from white to black and in between. And that could very easily be fed through a ramp to create any colors you want. So inside of your third-party renderer, you can do something like search for a ramp. And let's ramp these grayscale colors out. And what do we want that to look like? Well, let's twirl down this ramp and load in a preset. Grab any one of these. We're already doing all those rainbows, so let's just make it fiery colored. Output that as the emission color. And now all of those lines are fiery colored. So very handy to be able to render this out quickly inside of third-party render engines. And of course, splines render very, very quick in all of those. Now, it's important to note that Slicer was designed originally as a spline tool. So all of that geometry stuff is things that came later because we thought they'd be pretty handy. And we actually had to compensate for a bunch of limitations that the Cinema Extrude had. I'm not going to go into all of those limitations here, but I highly recommend watching the instructional video about the geometry tab. Next up, I would like to tackle just a few of the infinite possibilities you can create by combining text and Slicer. So opening up this file, I've got a text object. It is set to Lemon Milk, which is the official font of Rocket Lasso plugins, set to RKT. If you don't know where this object is, it's in the object menu, or in older versions of Cinema, it's the motext. So we've got this basic text, and I would like to start by making this flat. You can do that by changing the depth from 50 to 0, and now it's completely flat. It's like one cap is all that's being returned, which is very nice. Under my extensions, I will create a new slicer, drag that down to the bottom, and I would like to remote into the object, being the text, and you can now see a series of slices. Pivoting that from the bottom, or just clicking auto scale, I can jump that and match the overall object, create as many cuts as I like. Now, you might notice that we've got this open edges detected again. In this case, this is now two-dimensional. It is now not a volume. It couldn't hold water, which means any line going across is currently closed but should be open, and that's what it's warning us about. But let me show you why we set that warning up. So let's hide the text, and now we just have the lines. And I'd like to feed this slicer, which of course is a series of splines, into a sweep. So holding down Alt as I create a sweep object, and then holding down Shift as I create a end side, I have created the sweep setup. T for scale, scale down that end side so it's pretty small. And I'll even add a couple of extra sides to it. So we can see that overall setup looking good. NA, so it looks nice and smooth. But you'll see, where are our caps? Why are we seeing straight through it? Well, currently, this is returning a closed spline, meaning the line starts here, travels over, and then travels back again, essentially meaning these are like stretched out donuts, and that's why we don't see a cap. And this type of setup is why we made it so that Slicer will say, hey, we've detected open edges. So in this case, I could say, yes, open the spline up, and the instant I click that button, you'll see that these are now closed caps. And all that happened behind the scenes is in the Slicer, it set the spline from closed to open. So just keep that in mind. But anyway, now we've got this nice clean series of tubes all set up. It's a parametric setup, of course. We can select our slicer null, which is controlling the current orientation, and we can rotate that to some new angle. Something we haven't talked about inside of the slicer. No, actually we did. We talked about the auto scale. I will click the auto scale. What we didn't talk about is spacing. Our spacing right now is currently set up for the total size, but we can actually change that to per step. I could say, hey, I want another tube every 12 units. So every 12 units, it makes another one. Let's shrink that down smaller. So we'll drop this down until it looks about right. And there we go. Every 5 units, we're creating another slice, meaning that the scale is created by taking the spread multiplied by the slice count. So as I increase the slice count, we're going to get more slices, all with the exact same spacing. So that can be pretty handy. Even better, we have this convert button, meaning it will take the current math and automatically swap that mode to the opposite one. So it doesn't look any different, but now we're back to spread, and we can also convert it back again if we want to. But anyway, now we've got this nice spread going. Everything is spaced correctly. We could do things like animate this with a bit of rate. So hitting play, those will be animated, traveling along. We could change the spacing again. Let's drop those way down and scale up our end side and make those larger. We get these nice big giant tubes. So many fun ways of stylistically creating different text, and those are still automatically animated. Something I like doing is, let's see, how far can we push that? Actually, yeah, let's do this. Why not? I'm going to drop these sides down to 4. So essentially they are just squares. And we need enough lines for a bit of detail. And now look at the way that these start looking. I love this sort of crystal look. You see how these look like a, maybe some grown crystals. So I super dig that. Let's find a nice looking frame where there's no super skinny pieces. And yeah, so you can still read the text pretty well. A different font, maybe one that's not quite so fat would work better. So we could select this bold and set that to a medium. And yeah, that's a little bit more readable. And now we get this crystal look. Make as many cuts again as we want. If you were so inclined, you could add some of that variation in and just change the spacing on those a bit more. And now that we've got something like that, I might take this and feed it into a volume. Take this entire sweep, feed that into a volume builder, feed that into a volume mesher. I want a whole bunch of polygons. So the volume builder's voxel size will drop down to 1, maybe even smaller. I'm going to say 0.5. So we're going to go insane with the amount of detail here. So you see how crazy that meshes. But now that we've done that, I would like to take this mesher and maybe smooth it out a bit. So we'll do that with a smoothing deformer. Drop that in. You see everything gets a little bit smoother. Drop that to 0 and maybe crank this to maybe 25 iterations. So that gets nice and smoothed out on all the corners. And then create a plane effector. So this plane effector I'm going to actually use as a deformer. So moving that down, I'll rename it .deformer. I always do that just to make sure I don't forget that this isn't behaving like a normal effector. Instead, it's a deformer. And we can make it do something by saying, hey, you are now a point deformer. And now it's going to look all super crazy, but we can make that look better by going into the parameter tab. And I don't want this to push out on Y, so we'll set that to 0. Instead, I'd like it to push in on Z. So that just means into the surface. So -2, I think will do it nicely for us. And it's going to look kind of pinchy and scrunchy, but that can start looking pretty neat if in the fall off we add some effectors inside. Adding in a random field, we can now get some random noise applied to the overall shape. Now, basic noise can look fine, but let's make this look more like pitted metal. So changing that noise to maybe Poxo. Poxo is not one we use too often, but yeah, now look at this crazy pitted look that we get. That can end up being a little bit sharp, so it's not unusual for me to take another smoothing. And we'll just let that run like once, just to take off the hard edge on some of those. So yeah, look at this great looking pitted metal as actual geometry. And there's other looks you can do, of course, too, inside of the noise. Let's change that to, I don't know, Voronoi 3, which will make it kind of look like a hammered metal look. So somebody hit it a bunch of times with a hammer. That might get smoothed out a few more times just to round those some more. And yeah, really fun to play with these types of combinations. And keep in mind, this is all parametric. It's all set up. We could select the original text and say, this is actually 1, 2, 3. And that will filter all the way through and create the brand new look. And look at this crazy looking cool new thing. So yeah, I just love doing these different combinations. Putting that back to RKT. Let's move this into a different shape. We don't need much here. Why don't we jump this out to, actually, we don't need any of this. Let's start from scratch. So we just have the original text and let's give it some volume again. In this case, I would like it to have a depth of 50. And with that depth of 50, let's make another slicer from scratch. Brand new slicer, move it to the bottom, remote link in, hide the original text, have this pivot from, I guess the center's still fine. I'll, again, auto scale. And now we get this shape. This font actually slightly tapers down, but I'll create a couple extra slices, so that should be fine. And I could even, if I were so inclined, tilt that a little bit. Now, those are all tilted over. We have a lot of options to play with here. Keep in mind, we can always create geometry. So inside of the slicer, we could say, hey, return these flat sections. We could return extruded and give those some thickness and get these nice stripes going. Those could also be getting some bevel on top of it. And the new cinema bevel always looks really nice. If you're in R20, you unfortunately won't have the new cinema bevel, but in any of the newer versions, you get this, which looks cool. We could round those out even more. I do like setting this to percentage mode, so we can just scoot that back a hair and then put in a bunch of bevel. So that's now 100% maximum bevel. Maybe pull back a hair on that. So yeah, rounding those out looks really neat. We can pull back on the bevel if we want. Yeah, lots of fun combinations. We could say, hey, don't have a lower bevel, and now everything's going to be curving on the top. Let's say only have an upper bevel, and we can let those shrink all the way down and get these slices going. Change this angle however we are inclined. And of course, this is all still set up to be animated. So if we say, hey, let's give that a rate of 5%, then it's going to run through and generate this geometry as it goes. Just a lot of fun to combine those. Let's set that to an extruded, which is fine. Bevel size of 0. And let's say no cap, no end cap. Let's not do percentage. So now you can see we just get these thin, infinitely thin slices traveling along. Make those as tall as we're inclined. Maybe tilt this to the front. Here's an effect I like doing. If we tilt those to the front, we can get this really cool optical illusion as we make a different number of slices. Let's make not quite so many. And you can get this effect where it feels like it's moving towards us, even though it's, just traveling on this diagonal. The text isn't moving anywhere, but it feels like it's traveling towards us. Change that speed to go a little bit faster. Yeah, really fun. So many different combinations. Also keep in mind that we have the ability to go into the spline tab and we can reinterpret the way the splines are being fed through. So let's just simplify and say, hey, here's our spline being fed. And I can say, hey, interpret that spline as a B-spline. And now you see we get these curvy lines going. And that could be fun. So with those curvy lines being what's fed through, let's feed those back through the geometry, get those curves going and hit play. And now we get that animated. So lots of different combinations there. Now, we've got one more text concept I'd like to talk about. I would like to start it from scratch, so delete that slicer, and we are going to create a double cut setup. So we've got this original text. I would like to create a brand new slicer and do the same setup as we have been. Remote link into the text and hide it. And we get all these cuts, auto scale, create as many as we like. We could even angle it if we were so inclined, or I would say, in this case, let's overshoot it a bit to make sure that that line's not quite interfering because of that slight tilt on the this font. Okay, cool. We get all these slices. What if we return those as flat geometry? So that's cool. But then, what if we then take this geometry and cut it again, creating another slicer from scratch, move it to the bottom. I would like the object to be the slicer itself. Let's hide the original slicer, and now we've got these cuts. I would like to travel along the x-axis, so orientation x plus. And now you can see we get a series of cuts heading along. Let's match the overall length, so auto scale, and then open the splines, because once again, those 2D planes are not holding water. They're not volume, so let's open the spline. And now I can create as many cuts as I want across here and get essentially these needle shapes. Let's shrink that a bit, once again, to not get that overshoot. And now we've got a series of splines. What can we do with this? Well, again, let's try and sweep this. Throw that into a sweep, and then throw in something simple like a inside. Shrink that down, and now you can see we've got kind of this hexagon pattern traveling through all these little needle shapes. We can create a couple extra subdivisions if we were inclined. Set that up to 12, just makes it a little more round. And in the sweep, turn off the caps. And now we get all these pipes going. And now we have two different sweeps to control exactly the way the subdivisions are going. So I could say, hey, I want more cuts and get those nice and even across. And we can grab the first one. And this is controlling how many vertical ones there are. So we have slightly fewer to make those a little more even. And now we got a series of tubes going across exactly where the text is. Selecting the very first one. How about spinning that and getting those on some sort of angle? They need to be a bit taller. So let's spread that out a little bit more. Just make sure we're capturing all of them, or convert back and now add more cuts. And you see I won't mess up my spacing then. Very nice to be able to easily swap between those two. And yeah, we've got two different slicers creating this series of pipes for us. Keep in mind, it's all live, it's all parametric. So once again, selecting the original text, we can type in ABC, and that will automatically update. And we've got this layout. We just need to make sure that it's large enough to be catching all of those. Convert, create some extras, and convert back. Excellent. So working very nicely along those lines. But we can make that look a little bit crazier. Let's flatten that. And then instead of feeding in these circles, why don't we feed in some text? So I'll create a text spline, and we'll start out simple with, let's say, the letter L. So just type in the nice clean letter L, drop that in as the spline, and delete out the end side. And you're going to see it's going to look really crazy in the beginning. T for scale, and start shrinking down. And then eventually we're going to start seeing a bunch of the letter L. But the orientation's all kind of funky here. And also there's no caps. So in the sweep, let's say, yes, let's get those caps back. And then in the sweep as well, in the object tab, we need to say, don't do any banking. So let's turn off banking. And now you see the L's are actually vertical, but they're backwards. That's why I picked this letter L, so I could show that. So we got these backwards letter L's. So inside of our spline slicer, I'll say, hey, invert those. So under spline, reverse. And now we have some proper letter L's. Make those the correct size. So scale them up a bit, and now you see we've got some different letter L's going, but the letter L isn't terribly exciting. So let's change that to something like an X, and now we get this X shape filling up. So it's a series of letters made up by a letter. So it would be fun to make some different patterns there. But I would like to, let's add in some more text. Let's type in the letter P, but you'll see there's a lot of geometry here. If I hit NB, you can see how many different polygons are generated. And considering how small those are, I don't think we need that many. So on this font, I'll say, hey, the angle should be at 35 degrees. So you see fewer subdivisions. Excellent. So now that that's happening, let's change our text. Let's go back to the original text and go back to our KT. And we don't need too many cuts across. So I'm going to say, grab the second slicer, which is the ones that slice across X, and say, I would like there to be fewer. Let's drop that down. I'm trying to guess the right size. Maybe something around there will be correct. And now in that text, I'm going to type in the word slicer. So we got the entire word slicer. There we go. Actually worked pretty well. Now we get the entire word slicer traveling all the way across, copying again and again, running nice and quick. We can change that font to be something a little bit larger. Let's go find another copy of lemon milk. Bold. Oh, I clicked light. Bold. So yeah, now it's filling out. We maybe need a little bit less, or shrink it down just a hair. Scale that down. And we can use some more vertical ones. So let's add in, I don't know, jump to 65. Just guessing here. Yeah, that fills that out a little bit better. So now we got text made of text filling out all the space and just working really well, really quickly. Fun setup. We can modify this however we like, but nice and fun and readable. And zooming out, it's like, oh, and there's the text. Or even starting out small, zoomed in, and then zooming away, and eventually revealing a word made of word. Maybe even making a word made out of a word made out of a word as you kept on zooming out. Because you could take this entire thing, bake that down, and have that become the basis to copy again. Keep in mind all of the different animation tools we could be feeding through here. We could have an automatic rate traveling this through. We could potentially even cut this again from a different orientation. Type in any word, we can replace that original word still, which of course is still alive, XYZ, and that will update XYZ with the word slicer repeated. So very fun, and I love tinkering around with slicer combined with text. Next up, I would like to tackle the concept of custom landscapes. We've already got the scene file set up, so let's delete everything, and we just got a little bit of custom lighting. So a custom landscape. We've got the basic cinema landscape, which is very nice. We've got this even subdivision. What's important about this type of landscape is if you were to view this perfectly from the top, it's a perfect grid. It's going to look like exactly, let me zoom up and go to wireframe mode. You can see it's a perfect grid from this point of view, meaning no edge ever overlaps any other edge. So what if we take this concept and make it our own? And I made a lot of the animations that you saw in the commercial for Slicer using this technique. To begin with, I would like to make a plane, and we need to set this up however we like. I don't know what the exact scale will be, so let's also make a text spline. Put that in the middle and lie it flat on the ground. I'm going to set the font to you guessed it, lemon milk, but I'm going to use the thinnest one, so I'll use lemon milk light, and then scoot that a little bit more center, and just to keep it center and keep it simple and organized in my head, I will make a connect object and drop the spline in the connect. That way it's easy to scale this up or down if need be from the center point and still treat it as a text object. So I would like this to say slicer. So we got the word slicer going across, and then we can now scale our plane to kind of match this. So let's go double wide, so a width of 800. And that captures it all right, but let's go up to 1,500. Okay, cool. So we have double the height than we do width. So what number of subdivisions do we want? Well, it depends on how fast we want it to run and how smooth it should go. But I'm thinking 100 by 50 will do pretty well for us. You see, these are perfectly square, which just makes everything look a little bit cleaner. So that's a simple plane setup very precisely. So we want to deform this like a landscape. We've already once used a plane effector as a deformer, so let's do that again. Make a new plane, drop that underneath this plane, rename it .deformer to keep it organized. I want to deform the points, and I want them to push upward. And another way, instead of changing this axis, we can say the transform space should be based on the effector, and now you see it pushes it up into the air. So we don't want this to apply everywhere, only in some places. So how do we do that? We control it all through the fall off. And that's what's so much fun about this, is we can use all of the Mograph tools to create this type of rig. So to begin with, I don't want everything everywhere. So I'll start out simple and create a box field. This box field can be scaled, T for scale, and scale it up until we make a giant pyramid that goes all the way to the edge but doesn't affect that edge. And then selecting the box field, I can make it wider until it does the same thing on those edges for me. Excellent. So we get this overall pyramid shape. And then back into the plane deformer. I will temporarily turn that off because we will want it. What I'd like to do now is limit this pushing up to a spline. And that spline will be this connect. Dragging that connect in, we'll bring it in as a spline object. It's going to look super crazy, although I have made animations with this. You'll see if we view from the top, it is actually kind of readable. You can see the word slicer. It's very strange, but it does work. But that's because the connect came in as curve along. Let's actually use the spline shape mask, which is not one we use very often. The mask by default is on Z, so it's going to look all super crazy here. It's corresponding to the letters, but along Z. Instead, we'd like it to be along Y. And the instant we do, you can see that anywhere that that text is, it's getting deformed upward. Once again, carrying on the concept of a landscape. So that is falling off. You can see the mask fall off is based on the outside. So I can start increasing that and we get the fall off going even further. What I would like to do is keep on increasing that until it reaches every edge and even potentially goes beyond. So we can do that, and there we go. Now we've got a full range of that text going. Now, I don't want it to actually move those edges up, so we can use that box field we already made. Turning that on, I can say, hey, multiply on top of it. So you can see it's multiplying that, and the edges can't quite be affected. Now, I don't want the text falling out, so let's grab that box field, change its remapping, and I'll say, hey, the inner offset's going to be larger, and I want to capture that text so the text fully gets to the top before it falls away. And then finally, we can change the curvature of this by going into the contour and saying curve, and let's curve that sharply in the beginning so the edges can quickly ramp up. But then I don't mind this getting a little bit flatter near the top, so it kind of arcs down and sharply ends. So that should work pretty well there overall. It wouldn't be bad actually to even increase that text just a bit more to get it all the way to these corners. There we go. So now we've got this kind of crazy text fall off. Now the text isn't super readable right now. You can definitely see it's there, but it's not super readable. But let's make it even more messed up than it is by adding a random field. So this random field is going to be adding, actually it's set to max. Let's set that to overlay. And we'll move the overlay below the box, and that is now overlaying this noise on top of it, meaning this transitional area is getting, the darks are getting darker and the lights are getting lighter depending on the way those two colors overlap on top of each other. So let's turn these colors off, that doesn't matter. And selecting the random field, we can change its noise, maybe make this larger. So as I go larger until we can see something a little bit more consistent, we get that nice noise going. So that starts getting pretty messed up in a good way. And it's not terribly readable. But let's start playing around with applying slicer to this. So creating a extensions or plugin, slicer, drag that down below. I would like to be slicing an object. The object will be this plane, and hide the original plane. I would also like to auto scale to match the entire overall length. And now we can see we are slicing up along that entire size. Now here is, well, there's a couple things to talk about. There's a bunch of things to talk about. First of all, let's hide that original text. And you can now see that we are creating a landscape concept where we're cutting again and again and again until we kind of get the word slicer up on top. Now, you're going to see that's looking a little bit jagged here. So let's look at the original geometry, temporarily turning off slicer. This is a landscape. It's behaving just like the landscape object in Cinema. But something to keep in mind is that these corners are not necessarily planar. I'm trying to find one with a really heavy contrast. Where these shapes look, yeah, here's one. You see how that is a polygon, but that doesn't mean it's flat. If I zoom up on it and zoom around, you can see how it actually is pinching down in the center. So it's almost as if it's made up of two triangles. Cinema's not acknowledging it's two triangles, but it is two triangles. So we can actually have slicer do that as well. If I were to turn this on, you'll see we've got all these slices, but a bunch of the slices are like disappearing inside the object. You see that disappeared inside, that disappears inside. We can't even see any of this edge because it's perfectly along those sides. So what's going on there? Well, currently slicer is trying to create as few points as are needed. So if we go inside of the Modify tab, which we haven't even gone into for any of this video, we can turn on a setting called non-planar points. By turning on non-planar points, it is actually going to virtually triangulate this mesh and return that. So watch this missing gap right there. Turn on non-planar. At the instant I do, it is now triangulated that and created that bit of geometry. So now we can see this line traveling along the entire thing. In a lot of ways, it's now doubled our resolution. So hiding the original object. Again, you see our spline, we've got more detail, but the top is very, very flat. Well, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here. Let's just play around and try and make this look nicer. By selecting the slicer, let's add in a bit of smoothing. Let's add in 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of smoothing iteration. You see how everything got nice and smooth and clean. You push that even further if you want to, making more slices or less. Also, something I suggest, and I totally forgot to do, is in this original model, after we are deforming it, I would love to put one layer of smoothing on. So let's create a smoothing deformer and drop that in and say, okay, after all of that happens, do, let's see, 1, 2, yeah, let's do 2 layers of smoothing on there, just so everything gets a bit of a curve to it. So just by making that tweak, re-hiding it and turn this back on again, I think that this is going to give us way nicer looking geometry overall. So yeah, with just a couple iterations of smoothing, you see how all these jagged edges can get smoothed out. Now that we've done that, let's turn this into geometry. So under geometry, say flat, and now we've got all these flat layers. And now that we've done that, you can actually see the word slicer beginning to pop out from the top. This is entirely controlled by however we want to modify this original deformation. So if we go inside of that, I can say, hey, let's make this text a little more emphasized by going into the text, which we probably should rename text. By going inside of that text, I could say, I would like to remap it, and that remapping will be based on the curve. And let's say that up on the top, we want this to be pretty sharp. I'm going to sharply arc downward. And then on the bottom, it's going to kind of curve away, not quite as sharply. And now the top of this mountain has a lot more emphasis on it. Then going to our overlay, we could change the amount of overlay that there is. Right now it's already at max, but something I like doing is making double overlay, so it's overlaying 2 times. And now you can see that this noise is having a way bigger impact where you get more peaks on top of it. And now we get this text. We do have a lot of layers here, so under the slicer, let's pull back on that a little bit. We don't need quite so many. I think it might even become more readable if we reduce that. And now we get the word slicer poking through. Selecting our random field, we can give that some animation speed. Hitting play, that is now animated, and we're running on top of that. And you see we get this really nice text going, working quite nicely. Actually, yeah, I'm pretty pleased with that. Let's go and modify this even more. If we go into our slicer, into geometry, let's set that to extruded. The extruded will be set to percentage. That way we're perfectly covering that entire space. Here's another detail we should cover. Inside of modify, there is something called remove redundant points, and that is taking anything that's a perfectly straight line and it's trying to remove those points. You'll see this better if I get rid of all the smoothing. Here, you're going to see that there are what should have been points there, but it was perfectly straight, so it removed them. We can actually stop that from happening by saying, hey, don't remove redundant points, and then you can see those all pop back in again. That can be a good idea for doing things like putting in these layers of smoothing. That way those become more evenly spaced. So yeah, that's a small detail. But now that that has happened, let's take a look at some other things. One thing you can see here is we get these little pillars going on. That's mostly happening because of the smoothing. You see we get these little chunks, And as they get smooth, they're rounding out and thus get really small. Well, we have a setting to take care of that as well. Inside of modify, there's a setting called remove tiny, and then we have a threshold. Right now, those are not that tiny, but if we jump this up to, let's say 1, not quite enough, let's say 5, there we go, 5, and that's the distance of the entire length of it, was 5, so those disappear. They're so small that it's like, hey, just don't acknowledge those, they're too small. So now we get this really nice geometry, very clean, very even all the way along. Hitting play, we can now see this be animated, looking pretty nice overall. Let's go and tinker around a little bit more. Moving back into geometry, we can do all the same things we had been doing in the past. Let's add some bevel, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get a little bit of a problem here. And yep, okay, there it is. What we have happening here is this is internally using a Cinema 4D extrude, and the Cinema 4D extrude has limitations and quirks. I have an entire video talking about what we're doing and the way the Cinema one works, and I highly suggest checking out the geometry video in the instructions. What is happening here is we got this very detailed series of points, and it's pretty much a straight line, and the extrude doesn't know what to do with that. There could be ways around that as far as going into the modify. Maybe we could remove those redundant points. You see it did disappear because there's not quite as many points going around, but that isn't always a good solution. So you have to change the way this lays out sometimes. So right now we're perfectly in this flat area on the ground, but we could just say, hey, slicer, let's just scoot it up into the air a bit. So it's not quite catching that bottom-most spot. So there's already like a little bit of transition there. And it's going to now give us cleaner geometry. And then let's push this even further by going into the slicer and saying, let's get some rate going. So in addition to that noise animating, this is also going to be traveling upward, and it's going to be catching every bit of geometry, and we just have to see if all the layers look good or not. But actually, it seems to be doing a pretty good job overall. You will see that now that we have a very complex object, lots is going on, and then we are smoothing, and then we are extruding, and we're beveling. We are asking a lot of the Cinema 4D extrude. But keep in mind that it's all relative. This is running. If you hit, once you hit render, this would be going a lot quicker. And as mentioned, Slicer was designed as a spline tool, so all this geometry is a bonus. So if we go back to this spline and I hit play, you see we're going to be running at a pretty reasonable frames per second. Now keep in mind, actually, this is an important thing to talk about. I don't want to spend too long. Once again, check out the geometry video. But you can feed this through a Cinema extrude, but you have to be very careful because the Cinema 4D extrude is not expecting this type of spline. So what we could do is say, okay, let us send out a spline, and I would like to explode out all the layers. And we talked about that earlier. Let's explode layers. And now it's returning a null and a series of splines. But the Cinema 4D extrude is smart enough to know what to do with this. If we feed it into an extrude, I can say, don't be auto, be on Y. So it's going to push up on Y. And you see it's only doing one layer, but there's a very handy checkbox called hierarchy. If we turn on this hierarchy, then it's going to now see every single one of those layers. Unfortunately, the direction is different, so we have to set that to Z+. But now this is using the extrude and is pushing these all up into the air. So there we go. We get individual layers using Slicer inside of an extrude. And this type of setup can be important for certain cloner setups. You never know when you might want to have a separate extrude. For instance, if you wanted to have some additional settings inside of caps, let's say you wanted not it to be an n-gon, but to be something like the Delaunay calculation, you can turn that on here, and now you get that result, which can be really handy depending on what you're doing. So keep in mind the ability to do this extrude workflow. But even putting this back to an n-gon, if we were to give this a bit of bevel, so now we're in an almost identical setup to what we had in ours. If I hit play and let this animate, you see again, it's going to be running at that same speed. So we're doing everything we can to speed it up, but this is just what it takes to extrude this much geometry. But anyway, that is animating upward. It's looking pretty cool. Now, I think we're finally in a place where we can talk about one of the last options that we haven't inside of the slicer. Let's not explode layers, go back into geometry, and we had been using extrude, but instead of extrude, let's even simplify a bit, let's get rid of size. Instead of extrude, I would like to use landscape. Landscape is only supposed to be used in the situation like this, where essentially we're working from a landscape. So something similar to Cinema's landscape object or a custom one that we've made. So it's not going to do much if you're in a different setup. Clicking landscape in this setup, though, is making it so that every other layer combines, and now we can get these alternating slices. So this can be pretty cool and fun. You get some really nice, wacky layouts by doing this. So look at this like psychedelic slicer layout. Now, we could take this and, well, not extrude as much. Those could be smaller, thinner. We can even go to 0 and just have them be completely flat. And then you can go into your slicer tab and take the spacing and pull the spacing all the way down to 0 and make this completely flat. Now we've got this flat alternating layer. So I really enjoy using that. A couple of quick details. I don't want to spend too long because we do talk about this in the training. But when it comes to this alternating layer, we are currently animated. So if I hit play, you're going to see that actually it's working pretty well because we're probably not right on the bottom. But typically it's a good idea to turn on bottom here if you're doing this typical type of landscape setup, just to make sure that the layers properly travel through. Let's speed those layers up a bit actually. Let's do 15, should be fine. No, it's still not that fast. So let's say 15, and now those are traveling upward, and that is working very, very nicely. I really enjoy alternating mode. It actually unlocks a lot of possibilities, and a lot of the opening animation, even to this video, was made using this technique. So I want to make sure it's out there. And the ability to just modify this, let me turn that off and go to the original landscape, just to modify this and have it be whatever you want creates a lot of really fun opportunities. We could spend forever on these techniques and pushing it further and further. I don't want to spend any more time than we have to, so maybe I'll get some future tutorials going. I would like to add one last thing on here, just for fun, and that will be, let's animate this with some fancier field options. So let's go and temporarily turn off this noise. We just see the text. And let's say we want to animate that text. So over the course of the first couple frames, let's have that say slicer. Actually, at frame 60, we'll have it begin to say slicer. And the frame before, we'll just say RKT for rocket slicer. So now we get an RKT and keyframe that. So there's going to suddenly be a pop as that goes from one boop to the other. What if you didn't want that to be a pop? Well, there's really cool options inside of the fields, and the first one to talk about is going to be a delay. So typically, you probably use delay and mostly use the spring, and spring will work, but let's use this smooth option instead. So it is going to detect the change in how much these are being displaced and transition them more smoothly. So before it was a pop, but now when I hit play, and it gets to that moment, it's going to smoothly transition those different states. So a smaller smooth will be a quicker transition. You see that goes quicker. And a larger one is going to be a slower transition as it slowly morphs. So you got to decide exactly how you want that to be. I will do a little bit of smooth, and then let's make a second one. And the second one, I'll set that to spring and give it a decent amount of springiness. So now we can rewind, and now let's rewind all the way, and then you can see it starts out here, and then pop, and now it's going to even do that spring. So very, very fun being able to create that type of option, letting that pop and wiggle, and then we can put those noise overlays again if we want. And again, we can only have to do one, or we could do none. But now you can see how we can get that text to suddenly pop in and change, transition that way. And yeah, so many combinations. We've got this nice landscape going. Let's turn back on that slicer, hide the plane, and now we've got those alternating layers going. So let's see how that looks. Hit play. Those are still traveling upward. So we get RKT, RKT. And then slicer transitions in. So, and then of course, flattening that again. Slicer, spacing 0. So now it's flat, and these all just transition inward, and we can get that same animation, RKT, and then suddenly, bloop, and those pop in. So a lot of fun to be had here. I highly recommend tinkering around with these techniques. I think it opens up so many different opportunities. For our final section, I would like to talk about unleashing the power of slicers by using cloners. So I've got a very simple setup here, just a modified cube and this head. You can find that in the assets browser by searching for the word man. And we've got these zygote humans, so it's just like one of these characters. So pulled off the poor guy's head, and now we've got it here. Feeding this into a volume builder. That can now be set down pretty small. Let's get lots of detail down to 3, and then that gets fed into a volume mesher to get an actual mesh out of it. So now we got something that we can slice, creating a slicer, moving that to the bottom. I would like to link to the model. So object, volume mesher, hide the original model. Now we got all these cuts. Now, if we're going to use a cloner to do this, well, how do we want to go about doing that? Well, I'm thinking, what if we create a single slice and it's got a spread a height of nothing. So it's all zeroed out. So we get one cut. So then we take that one cut and we put that into a cloner. And that cloner I'll set to linear, and that's now cutting upward. So let's say every 5 units, it's making an entire different duplicate of slicer. So now we can start increasing this and get more and more cuts via a brand new slicer being created. Now, a very important thing to note here. Now, the reason that the slicer only cuts in a single orientation, say Y plus or Z plus or whatever we rotate to, is because we have to sort every single point of that model and then do the cut. And that can take a significant amount of calculation time. So we just didn't build that in directly, but you can do that functionality by doing it through a cloner. So every single copy of the slicer is a brand new slicer that can be a brand new direction. Having done that, why don't we move this cloner a little bit lower so we can actually catch the entire shape, and then a few extra clones so we get the entire model. Okay, cool. So we get all these different cuts happening, but now we can feed in something like a random effector, which right now will move everything randomly, and that up and down will show different slices. But what if we don't move up and down? Instead, we turn on rotation, and now I can type in, let's say, 15 degrees, and now each of those is a slightly different orientation for their cut. Selecting the single slicer, we can say the geometry should create a flat bit of geometry, and now we can see that we are able to see the model from slightly different angles. In the random, let's jump this up to 90 degrees, and now we can see completely randomized cuts filling out this overall space. Keep in mind that there is going to be a calculation hit. There's a time hit because every single copy is requiring a brand new calculation of every point on the model. Having said that, a couple things we could possibly do to speed this up being, let's make there be not as many, so let's make there be 10 spaces between every single one, and now we probably only need about half as many of the cuts. You could tell the slicer to have additional cuts. So instead of just doing one cut, what if we say, hey, the spread is 50, and you can do 3 cuts. So now every one of those is calculating once and then creating 3 slices. So that could speed you up, but you will get a couple of cuts in sync. So depending if that's something that gets in the way or not, something to keep in mind. Dropping that back down to 1 cut, you can create some cool looks just by randomizing this. Let's get some different layouts. That's a little bit better. Kind of like that one. That one's neat. So yeah, we get these different layouts. And of course, all the same functions can work. We can add on the extruded, make this pretty thin. We don't want to go too much, but yeah, just add a little bit of depth to that. And it starts looking pretty interesting. You make a lot of new things by doing this type of technique. Let's change this to be flat again and do a different cloner layout. This time, let's imagine that we are, well, not imagine, let's pull out the slicer temporarily and keep this nice and simple. Let's create a plane, and that plane will be on Z+. So we get this plane. So if we were to put that into the cloner, first of all, right now it's randomized, so let's delete the random. We don't need that. And then in the cloner, I'm going to say, I want this to now be set to radial. So now you can see we get the star shape, but we want to zero out that radius. And now we can create additional copies. Now, keep in mind, every other one essentially looks like it's half as many. And that's because they're in alignment with their opposite one. So we want to keep this count on odd numbers. You can see how we kind of start getting this crazy radial pattern. Let's do the same thing, but with slicer. Deleting the plane, we can turn on slicer. And the slicer needs to be on the same Z plus. And you see we get a single cut along this figure. Dropping that inside the cloner, it'll now create an array of slicers, each of them cutting from the model, and now we end up with this shape. And as long as that is an odd number, those won't be overlapping each other. We can create as many as we want. Let's jump it up to 29, and then we get lots of detail in the overall model. Selecting the cloner, we could rotate this to any angle. Let's spin this forward, and you can see that that pivot point can now line up maybe a little bit with the nose. And yep, lots of different layouts you can do there. Of course, you could add randomness on top of that as well. We could just say random, and now those will still be spiral, but their random position will be modifying it a bit. So we could lower that down to something like 5 by 5 by 5, just a little variation there. And then, of course, rotation will go a long way. We can say a 5-degree rotation there, and maybe 15. Mostly radial, but now you see we get a bunch more chaos introduced. Lots of combinations to do just by playing around with radial as well. And you see how much you can unlock. But it does take a little while to calculate now, even with this many slices, and not that crazy of a model. If I change this number, you can see that little hiccup until it finally calculates right there. Yeah, so not too long, but not nearly as fast as a single slicer doing its thing. Now let's push this even a little bit further still. Let's go back to linear and reset the PSR. scoot that back down a little bit further. And again, put the slice to be on Y+. So now we've got a series of vertical slices. Well, each of those slices is, let's make them be back to 5. So now there's 5 between each one, and we'll need a lot more slices. And then we'll say that our slicer should have a geometry extruded, and that extruded geometry should be 5 as well. So now they're filling in the spacing, and it's very similar to the way we would normally have a slicer. But now that these are individual objects, we can use the cloner to do additional things. Things like randomizing the color. So let's set the cloner's transform tab to black. And now that that's black, we can add in a random effector. And I would like the random effector to go from 0 to 100. Don't affect the position, but yes, I would like to affect the color with a custom color. And that can go all the way up to white now. And if we turn on use alpha strength, then that should automatically make every possible color between white and black on these different bits of geometry. So that's kind of neat by itself. We get all these different colors going on the geometry. But now let's push this even further by using some third-party render stuff again. Here is a simple wood material. If I double click it, it's already redshift. And it's just an image fed into the diffuse channel. Let's apply that wood material onto one of the clones. And I'd like to set it to cubic. So that's the lazy person's way of applying a material. So you can see it's repeating, but it's like identical on every single one of them. That's not what we want. That doesn't make this look like a sliced up wooden statue. So how might we go about doing that? Well, let's pull that user data in again. So we'll say user data, pull in color user data, and we can output that to the surface. And let's see what that is outputting. Once we set the user data to object display color, and then inside of the redshift render view, we can hit go. And now we should see those colors translating into redshift. So, okay, good. We've got these different colors, but we want to actually see it via this material. We want to see some variation on this material. So let me pop that in. You see, okay, there's the wood, but it's, identical. So the first thing I'd like to do is let's make these get randomly placed in different spots. Inside of this texture, we have something called an offset. There's also a rotate and scale, but let's keep it simple and just use this offset. Drag that in. So if this is outputting black to white, it's outputting anything from 0 all the way up to 1. So let's change that range. I'm going to search for the word range. And we have a change range. I would like to change this value from 0 to 1 to 0 to, let's say, 500. And let's say that is going to affect this offset. Because every one of those layers is different, you can now see that every single one of them is getting an offset version of that cubic mapping. So right out of the gate, that works really nicely. I like that. Let's do this again by copying this change range, and let's change the range differently this time. What I'd like to do this time is get a color correct. So here's a color correct node. Let's output the final texture. So here's that texture, and if we output it, we can see that it is just that final wood material, looking good. But what if we want to randomize the gamma? So let me squeeze this in, a little hard to get all these in one screen. So what if we want to randomize this gamma? Well, let's go ahead and feed in this change range from 0 to 1 to 0 to 1. And we'll say that goes into the gamma. It's going to look a little bit crazy, but let's see what we get. Yeah, a bunch of these turn black, and then we got some lighter ones. But that's because this gamma, by default, is usually at 1. So we want to stay around 1. So let's change the range from 0, which would be black, and 1, which is normal. Let's change that to 0.5, which is half the amount, and 2, which is double the amount. And now look at all that randomizing that we're getting out of just this single color user data and pulling the display color out from the cloner. So let's feed that into the actual diffuse color, and then we'll output that as our final material. And now we've got those offset colors set up, ready to be lit and animated, and anything we want to do. That's how you can set up, some variation using Redshift and using a cloner setup. So that wraps up this quick start video. As I mentioned, you definitely want to go and check out those instructional videos on how to use all the other settings. There's definitely settings we didn't touch upon here, but they would be relevant depending on what you're trying to create. Thank you so much for checking this out and for purchasing Slicer from Rocket Lasso, and I'll see you in future live streams, tutorials, and plugins. Bye-bye, everybody.